The Skinwalker Enigma Part 1. The Inheritance of Strangeness, Chapter 1. The Reluctant Custodian. Brandon Fugal was a man who dealt in certainties. His world was one of concrete, steel, and glass, a tangible reality of sprawling business parks and shimmering office towers etched against the Salt Lake City skyline. He traded in square footage zoning laws and the predictable ebb and flow of capital. His faith, a cornerstone of his life, was built on a foundation of scripture and revelation, a different kind of certainty, but a certainty nonetheless. The paranormal, the unexplained, the fuzzy shapes on grainy film, these were the domains of late-night television and supermarket tabloids. They were not part of his meticulously constructed world until the day they were. October 14th, 2016. The date was seared into his memory like a cattle brand. He stood on a dusty path overlooking the property he had controversially acquired, a 512-acre tract of land in Utah's Uinta Basin that locals spoke of in hushed, fearful tones. Skinwalker Ranch. Even the name felt alien on his tongue. He'd bought it as a skeptic, albeit an open-minded one driven by a strange confluence of a nagging faith crisis and the persuasive arguments of two scientists who had worked for the previous owner, billionaire Robert Bigelow. They spoke of things his logical mind rejected, but which a deeper, more inquisitive part of him, the part that stared at the stars as a boy and pondered the age-old questions of existence, could not entirely dismiss. The Utah sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. The air was thin and crisp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. He was with a small security detail, men he'd just met, their faces impassive beneath the brims of their caps. The silence of the place was profound, a living entity that seemed to press in from all sides. It wasn't peaceful, it was watchful. Then one of the security men yelled. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure astonishment. His arm shot up, finger stabbing at the sky above the jagged line of the mesa. Brandon's head snapped up, and his world of certainties fractured. Hanging in the air, silent and immense, was an object that had no right to exist. It was a disc. A classic saucer shape rendered in a dull silvery gray metal that seemed to absorb the harsh daylight rather than reflect it. It was utterly devoid of seams, rivets, lights, or any visible means of propulsion. It was by his best estimate 40 to 50 feet across. It was real, it was solid, and it was there. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, it simply hovered. Then it moved. It wasn't flight as any human understood it. It was an instantaneous violation of physics. It darted left then right, covering hundreds of yards in the blink of an eye, with no inertia, no sonic boom, no disturbance of the air. It was as if the laws of motion had been temporarily suspended in that patch of sky. It then shot straight up, shrinking to a pinpoint of light before executing a right-angle turn that would have turned any human pilot into a red smear. And then it was gone, vanished. The entire event lasted no more than 20 seconds. Silence rushed back in to fill the void heavier than before. The security guards were babbling, their professional composure shattered. Brandon stood, frozen his heart, hammering against his ribs. The foundations of his reality had been dynamited. That single 20-second event was a point of no return. He was no longer an open-minded skeptic. He was an experiencer. And this land, his land, was no longer just an intriguing property. It was the epicenter of a mystery that demanded to be solved, whatever the cost. The reluctant custodian had just received his calling. Chapter 2. The Vanguard. The first phone call Brandon made was to a man named Bryant Arnold, though everyone called him Dragon. A former Marine current law enforcement officer and a man whose physical presence was as imposing as his nickname Dragon was the bedrock of ranch security and operations. But he was more than just muscle. He was a gatekeeper of the ranch's dark history. Brandon found him by the old homestead, his gaze fixed on the horizon, a place where he'd seen things that haunted his waking hours. "You saw it then," Dragon said. "It wasn't a question." "I saw it," Brandon confirmed, his voice still hollow with shock. Dragon nodded slowly, a grim understanding in his eyes. "Welcome to the party. Now you know why the rules are different here." Dragon's fierce protectiveness of the ranch and his almost paranoid insistence on protocols, especially his vehement opposition to digging, was born from a brutal personal encounter with the phenomenon. Years prior, long before Brandon's ownership, driven by a mix of frustration and bravado, Dragon had taken a shovel to a patch of ground known for strange energy readings. He'd dismissed the old legends as superstitious nonsense. 3 days later, a goose egg appeared on the back of his head. Within hours, it had spread his entire scalp, separating from his skull in a wave of unimaginable, excruciating pain. Doctors at the emergency room were baffled, calling his condition medically impossible. The ranch had pushed back and it had nearly killed him. Dragon learned a lesson that day, written in agony: this land was not to be trifled with. He wasn't just the head of security, he was the ranch's most sober and scarred survivor. The scientific spearhead of the new investigation would be Dr. Travis Taylor, a man with a resume that read like a science fiction protagonist PhDs in optical science and engineering, aerospace engineering work with NASA and the Department of Defense. Travis was a brilliant mind chafing at the bit of conventional science. He'd spent decades working on classified projects where the truly interesting data was often locked away, the truly revolutionary questions left unasked. For Travis, Skinwalker Ranch wasn't a place of ghosts and monsters. It was the ultimate laboratory. It was a place where the laws of physics seemed to be negotiable, and for an experimentalist, there was no greater temptation. So you're telling me Travis had said during their first meeting, a skeptical grin playing on his lips, that you have a location with reproducible high strangeness events, a place where the signal-to-noise ratio for anomalous phenomena is off the charts? I'm telling you, I saw something I can't explain, Brandon replied, and I'm willing to fund a proper scientific investigation to find out what it was. That was all Travis needed to hear. The grin became one of pure, unadulterated scientific curiosity. Rounding out the core team was Eric Bard, the quiet, methodical technology and communications expert. If Travis was the brilliant freewheeling theorist, Eric was the grounded guardian of the data. His world was one of radio frequencies, sensor arrays, and the endless stream of binary code that would be their eyes and ears. Eric approached the ranch with a cool detachment, his job to measure, record, and analyze, filtering the extraordinary through the unblinking lens of empirical data. He was the team's anchor to reality, the man who would translate the whispers of the phenomenon into graphs, charts, and hard numbers. Together with general contractor Jim Morris, providing cultural liaison with the local Native American tribes, and the ever-imposing Caleb Bench assisting Dragon with security, they formed the Vanguard. They were a motley crew of believers, skeptics, and agnostics, united by a single audacious goal to apply the scientific method to the heart of the impossible. Chapter 3, The Ghost in the Machine. Their first challenge wasn't a spectral entity or a silent silver craft. It was the ranch itself, which seemed to possess a mischievous and at times downright malevolent intelligence that actively resisted their attempts to study it. The team descended upon the property with truckloads of state-of-the-art equipment, high-resolution surveillance cameras, magnetometers, radiation detectors, spectrum analyzers, and GPS units accurate to within a centimeter. They were determined to blanket the 512 acres in a web of sensors that would capture anything and everything out of the ordinary. The ranch, however, had other ideas. Brand new batteries would drain in minutes, their chemical energy seemingly siphoned off into the ether. Heavy-duty generators would sputter and die for no reason, only to roar back to life the moment they were hauled off the property line. Eric Bard, a man who could coax a signal from the depths of space, would watch in frustration as his laptops crashed screens, dissolving into a cascade of nonsensical characters, his meticulously coded software corrupted by an unseen force. "It's like the place is generating a targeted EMP," he muttered to Travis one evening, hunched over a dead hard drive in the command center. "But it's localized and selective. It's not just frying everything, it's frying the things we need the most." The GPS anomalies were the most disorienting. A team member standing in the middle of a flat pasture would see their GPS position suddenly report them as being 30 feet underground or a quarter mile to the east before snapping back to reality. It was a subtle digital gaslighting that eroded one's confidence in the very tools of modern science. But amidst the technological chaos, a pattern began to emerge. A signal. It was Eric who first isolated it. A persistent narrowband radio frequency at 1.6 gigahertz. It wasn't a broadcast from any known satellite or terrestrial source. It was clean, almost structured, and it pulsed with a strange regularity. More unnervingly, its source was impossible to triangulate. One moment it seemed to be coming from the sky, directly above the triangular-shaped pasture they had started calling the Triangle. The next, it seemed to emanate from the ground beneath their feet. Travis Ever, the experimentalist, devised a simple but ingenious tool, a directional antenna housed inside a coffee can. Walking the property with this crude detector, he looked less like a PhD scientist and more like a post-apocalyptic scavenger. The can shields the detector from stray signals, he explained to a bemused Brandon. The only signal it can pick up is the one coming straight down the pipe. It's high school science, but it works. He swept the coffee can across the horizon, the connected meter remaining silent. But as he slowly angled it upward toward the sky above the triangle, the needle on the meter began to twitch. Higher and higher, he aimed until the can was pointing almost straight up, the meter redlined. "It's coming from up there," Travis said, his voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Roughly 5,000 feet up, there's a persistent energy source hanging in the sky right over the triangle." There was nothing there, just empty blue sky. The 1.6 gigahertz's signal became their ghost in the machine. It wasn't just random noise, it felt like a presence, a heartbeat. A silent, invisible sentinel watching them from a mile above, a sentinel that could reach down and touch their equipment at will, scrambling their data and draining their power. They were no longer just observing the ranch. They were beginning to realize that the ranch, or whatever resided there, was observing them right back. Part 2, Poking the Hornet's Nest. Chapter 4, The Triangle of Impossibility. The area designated the Triangle soon became the undisputed epicenter of the investigation. It was a wedge-shaped pasture of scrub and dry grass that was on the surface utterly unremarkable. Yet it possessed an atmosphere, a palpable quality that set the teeth on edge. The air felt heavier, sound seemed to die quicker, and the constant low-level hum of anxiety that permeated the entire ranch was amplified tenfold within its boundaries. It was here that the 1.6 gigahertz's signal was strongest. It was here that compasses spun uselessly. It was here that the team decided to focus their efforts. Their first major experiment was an attempt to send a probe into the mile-high zone where Travis had pinpointed the source of the energy. They tethered a large weather balloon, equipping its payload with a suite of energy detectors, radiation dosimeters, and a GPS tracker. "The goal is simple," Travis announced at the pre-launch briefing. "We send our sensor package up into the anomaly, get real-time data on what it is, and bring it back down." The launch was perfect. The large white balloon ascended gracefully into the clear sky, a fragile offering to the invisible presence above. In the command center, Eric tracked its progress data streaming back to his monitors. Ascending through 2,000 feet, 3,000, all sensors are green. "We're getting some interesting EM spikes, but nothing crazy yet," he reported, his voice calm and professional. Coming up on 5,000 feet, Travis announced from the field, his eyes glued to the balloon through a pair of high-powered binoculars. The target zone. On Eric's screen, the balloon's icon blinked at 5,100 feet, 5,200, 5,280 feet, exactly 1 mile. Then everything went dead. "I've lost the signal," Eric said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "All data streams just stopped. GPS is gone. It's not updating." "What do you mean gone?" Brandon asked, stepping closer to the screen. "I mean it vanished," Eric replied, his voice tight. "One telemetry packet was there, the next was not. It's like it was just erased from existence." In the field, Travis let out a string of curses. The balloon, which had been a clear white dot against the blue, was no longer there. It hadn't popped, it hadn't drifted, it had simply ceased to be. They scanned the sky for hours. The balloon and its expensive payload were never seen again. Undeterred, the team regrouped. "If we can't get a sensor up there, let's see if we can get something through there," Travis proposed. "Maybe there's a physical barrier." The idea sounded absurd, but the ranch had already proven that the absurd was its baseline. The new plan was audacious. They would use a helicopter to drop a series of weighted canisters, each equipped with a GPS tracker, directly through the mile-high zone over the triangle. From the command center, they watched the helicopter's camera feed as it hovered at 6,000 feet. "First drop in 3, 2, 1. Activate," the pilot's voice crackled. A canister fell away, tumbling towards the Earth. On the tracking screen, its icon descended rapidly. It passed the 5280-foot mark without incident. Then at roughly 4500 feet, the impossible happened. The canister's downward velocity abruptly slowed, and its trajectory curved as if it had been swatted aside by a giant unseen hand. It landed hundreds of yards outside the triangle. What the hell was that? Dragon's voice rumbled from the back of the room. Did you see that Cameron Eric radioed to the pilot? We saw a significant deviation from the ballistic trajectory. That's an understatement, the pilot replied, his voice strained. It looked like it bounced off something. We've got a tailwind up here, but it pushed it against the wind. They dropped another. The same thing happened at a slightly different altitude, and another. Each canister seemed to impact an invisible and apparently mobile object in the sky. They were dropping solid objects through thin air, and the air was pushing back. The laws of physics, conservation of momentum, ballistic motion were not just being bent, they were being shattered. The triangle wasn't just the source of a mysterious energy signal. It was guarded by an invisible wall, a shield of impossible physics that defied all rational explanation. Chapter 5, Ampere's Dialogue in Fire. The discovery of an invisible kinetic barrier in the sky shifted the team's paradigm. They weren't just dealing with a passive phenomenon. They were dealing with something that could actively, physically interact with their world. The question now was, could they make it show itself? If it can stop a solid object, it must have mass or energy density. Travis theorized, pacing excitedly in the command center. What happens if we hit it with something fast, something hot? Let's launch some rockets. The plan was simple: launch a series of consumer-grade rockets up through the triangle while a high-speed camera capable of filming at 1,000 frames per second recorded every millisecond of the flight. The first rocket was mounted on the launch pad in the center of the triangle. The air was still, the tension palpable. Everyone ready, Travis called out. Eric, are you monitoring for energy spikes? All sensors are hot. Eric's voice came back over the radio. Go for launch. Launching in 3, 2, 1. With a whoosh of compressed air and a trail of white smoke, the rocket shot skyward. It ascended cleanly for about 100 feet. Then it suddenly and violently veered off course, tumbling end over end as if it had struck a sheet of plate glass. It fell back to the earth, its flight path a mockery of a clean ascent. Did you see that? Caleb yelled. It turned on a dime. The high-speed footage was even more baffling. Frame by frame, they watched the rocket fly true. In one frame, its path was clear. In the very next, 1,000th of a second later, its nose was crumpled and it was spinning away. There was no visible object, no distortion in the air, just an instantaneous, violent deflection. It's the barrier, Travis said, his eyes wide. It's real, and it's low. 100 feet, maybe less. They decided to launch another, hoping to replicate the event. This time, however, something different happened. The second rocket shot straight up, passing the 100-foot mark, the 1,000-foot mark without any interference. It was a perfect, beautiful launch. But just as a collective sigh of confused relief went through the team, a new object appeared in the sky. It was an orb of brilliant white light appearing from nowhere directly above the ascending rocket's smoke trail. It paced the rocket for a moment before accelerating away at a speed no conventional aircraft could match. Eric, anything on ADS-B? Travis shouted into his radio, referring to the aircraft tracking system. Negative. The sky is clear. Nothing commercial, nothing military. Eric responded, his voice laced with awe. That's no satellite, it just vanished. It was gone. The orb had appeared, observed their experiment, and departed. The correlation was undeniable. The first rocket had been a warning, a physical pushback. The second had been allowed to pass, and its launch had been met with the appearance of an observer. It was no longer an experiment, it was a conversation. They were sending up flares of technology, and something was answering from the void. The hornet's nest had been poked, and something had definitely flown out. The team prepared a third rocket, a sparkler model designed to create a bright visual effect, their excitement warring with a deep-seated apprehension. They were communicating, but they had no idea what they were talking to or what it might say next. Going hot in 5, 4, 3. The countdown was cut short by a blinding flash and a deafening crack. The third rocket exploded on the launch pad, engulfing the area in a ball of fire and acrid smoke. "Fire! We've got a fire!" Dragon yelled, already moving with a fire extinguisher. The message was clear. The dialogue was over. Chapter 6. The Invisible Behemoth. The rocket explosion, initially dismissed as a malfunction, took on a terrifying new context when the team reviewed the high-speed camera footage. In the frames immediately preceding the detonation of the third rocket, the one that exploded on the pad, something was visible where the first rocket had been deflected. It wasn't a solid object. It was a shimmering, amorphous distortion in the air, a blob-like anomaly that seemed to bend the light around it. It was visible for only a handful of frames, a few thousandths of a second before vanishing. It was colorless transparent, yet it had substance. It was the first visual confirmation of the invisible force they were dealing with. "We may be looking at the anomaly for the first time, guys," Travis said, his voice hushed as he stared at the monitor. It was their Moby Dick, a brief, tantalizing glimpse of the invisible behemoth that ruled the skies of the ranch. The team became obsessed with capturing another image of this blob. If it had substance, it should interact with more than just rockets. They brought in pyrotechnical expert Nathan Whitehead and a powerful flamethrower. The new plan was as simple as it was primal blast the area where the blob had appeared with a 2000-degree jet of fire and film it with the high-speed camera. "If there's anything there, the flame will have to go around it," Nathan explained, his face shielded behind a thick visor. "You'll see a void, a hole in the fire." The roar of the flamethrower shattered the ranch's silence. A massive tongue of orange and yellow flame shot into the sky, directly through the 3 one-foot-high zone where the blob had been seen. To the naked eye, it was just an impressive, albeit terrifying display of pyrotechnics. But the high-speed camera saw the truth. Played back at a crawl, the footage was breathtaking. The column of fire wasn't solid. It was riddled with empty spots, black voids where the flames seemed to part and flow around unseen obstacles. The most prominent void was at the exact 31-foot mark. Something was there completely invisible to the eye, yet substantial enough to split a jet of fire in two. It was the same phenomenon, but this time it was completely invisible. Why could they see it during the rocket launch, but not now? The question hung heavy in the air. The next technological leap came with LiDAR light detection and ranging. A drone carrying a LiDAR unit would fly over the triangle, bombarding the area with millions of infrared laser pulses per second to create a precise three-dimensional point cloud map of the environment. Anything the laser hit, visible or not, would create a return, adding a point to the map. They combined the experiments. They would launch another rocket, hoping to stimulate the anomaly while the LiDAR drone mapped the airspace above. The rocket launch was clean, but the LiDAR data was anything but. Jim Royston, the LiDAR expert, stared at his screen, his brow furrowed in confusion. "This is wrong," he said. "The rocket should be a tight, straight line of data points as it ascends. But look at this." He pointed to the screen. As the virtual rocket passed the 30-foot mark, the dense cloud of LiDAR data points around it scattered, wildly dispersing as if blown away by a powerful wind. The points moved out of the way. Travis realized aloud. The anomaly is there, and it's pushing the laser beams aside. It's bending light. But the truly mind-bending discovery came later, after hours of processing the high-resolution data. In the sky, directly above the center of the triangle, the LiDAR had mapped a structure. It was vast, symmetrical, and utterly bizarre. It looked like a giant, invisible hourglass or funnel, its narrowest point hovering just above the ground before widening out into the sky. And in certain areas, particularly near the center, there were holes in the data. Not just fewer data points, but a complete and total absence of them. "It's a data void," Eric explained, zooming in on a perfect circular black hole in the point cloud. "The laser pulses went into that spot, and they just didn't come back. They went somewhere else." The invisible behemoth now had a shape. It was a structured geometric energy field that could deflect rockets, part flames, and swallow light. And at its heart was a shadow, a hole in their reality, a doorway through which their photons disappeared without a trace. The Native American legends of portals on this land no longer sounded like folklore. The team was staring at a 3D map of what could only be described as a wormhole. Part 3, The Belly of the Beast, Chapter 7, The Earth's Echo. The revelation that the anomaly was a structured geometric shape hanging in the sky forced the team to reconsider everything. Was this phenomenon purely atmospheric, or was it connected to the ground beneath their feet? The legends of the Ute tribe, which Jim Morse had painstakingly gathered, spoke not only of sky gods and portals, but of sacred ground of powers that resided deep within the earth. A ground-penetrating radar GPR expert, Phil Oviatt, was brought in to create a map of the ranch's subterranean world. He began his scans at Homestead 2, a dilapidated wooden structure with a long and terrifying history of paranormal activity, disembodied voices, shadowy figures, and crushing feelings of dread. As Phil methodically scanned the ground around the old building, a strange shape began to resolve on his monitor. It was a smooth, symmetrical, dome-like feature buried just a few feet beneath the surface. "How do you interpret that?" Travis asked, peering over Phil's shoulder. Well, Phil said, tracing the perfect arc on his screen, it looks like a dome feature. It's not a natural geological formation, it's too uniform. The idea of a buried dome-shaped object directly beneath a hot spot of paranormal activity was too tantalizing to ignore. Despite Dragon's grave warnings about the dangers of digging, the evidence was compelling enough to convince even him that a cautious investigation was necessary. A drill rig was brought in. Tom Winterton, the ranch superintendent and a man who had experienced his own share of high strangeness, was visibly nervous. "You guys be careful," he said before pointedly getting in his truck and driving to the far side of the property. He wanted to be as far away from the drilling as possible. The team marked the spot directly over the anomaly. As the powerful auger began to churn, a low vibration ran through the ground. Suddenly, a nearby utility pole began to shake violently, its power lines whipping back and forth as if in a hurricane. "Is somebody messing with that wire?" Brandon yelled over the noise of the drill. "Who would be there?" Dragon shot back, scanning the empty landscape. The ground itself seemed to tremble. The drill operator, a seasoned professional, looked spooked. The shaking was intense, localized entirely to their position, and deeply unnatural. It felt less like a geological tremor and more like the angry growl of a disturbed beast. After a few terrifying moments, the shaking stopped as abruptly as it had begun. They pushed on drilling a series of holes into the ground, lowering cameras and sensors into the earth. But the results were inconclusive. They found nothing solid, no metal, no structure, just compacted soil. The dome that was so clear on the GPR remained elusive, a ghost in the dirt. Had the GPR been deceived by a pocket of dense clay, or was the dome itself, like the anomaly in the sky, something non-physical, an energy field that could trick their sensors? The investigation turned to the mesa, the massive rock formation that dominated the ranch's skyline. It was into this solid wall of rock that a UAP had been filmed flying and another filmed emerging. If there was a connection between the sky and the ground, the mesa was the prime suspect for a point of entry. The team decided to drill horizontally into the rock face. The process was slow, the whine of the diamond-tipped drill bit echoing across the valley. For days, it was nothing but rock dust and frustration. Then, about 80 feet in, the drill hit something. The high-pitched scream of the motor changed to a grinding, labored groan. The drill, which had been chewing through solid rock, stopped dead. "What's going on?" Thomas Travis yelled to the operator. "We've encountered a hard object that it cannot penetrate." They tried to push through, increasing the torque, but the drill bit wouldn't budge. They pulled it back, the bit scarred and blunted. They repositioned the rig a few feet higher and started a new hole. This time the drill penetrated for a while before the operator felt a sudden, inexplicable upward pressure. The drill was physically pushed up as if something below had deflected it before it continued on its path. The core samples and shavings from the drill holes were collected and sent to the University of Utah for metallurgical analysis. The results that came back were stunning. Mixed in with the normal rock dust were flecks of exotic materials, tellurium, vanadium, and most significantly, a concentration of pure elemental selenium. The metallurgists at the university were clear the material was not natural. It was manufactured centered like a ceramic, similar in composition to the heat-shielding tiles on the space shuttle. And selenium, as Travis ominously pointed out, is a key component in advanced optical research used in experiments to create metamaterials that can bend light, the theoretical foundation for a cloaking device. The implications were staggering. Deep inside the ancient solid rock of the mesa was a manufactured high-tech material capable of withstanding incredible heat and potentially rendering something invisible. The UAPs seen flying into the mesa weren't crashing, they were docking. The mesa wasn't a solid wall of rock, it was a hangar. Chapter 8, The Transmedium Traveler. The evidence was converging. An invisible energy-swallowing structure in the sky, a potential energy dome beneath the ground, and a high-tech cloaked object or facility hidden inside the mesa. The team began to suspect they were not dealing with separate phenomena, but with different components of a single, vast, and interconnected system. The theory was radical, but it fit the data. Skinwalker Ranch was a transit point, a nexus. The most compelling evidence for this came from a piece of surveillance footage that Eric Bard had been analyzing for weeks. It was a nighttime shot from a camera pointed at the mesa. At first, it showed nothing but the dark, looming shape of the rock against a starry sky. Then a small point of light appeared, seemingly out of nowhere in the sky, just above the ridge. "Watch what happens in the sky just above," Eric said, his voice low as he played the footage for the team. The point of light streaked downward, not like a meteor, but with controlled, intelligent movement. It moved behind the mesa and disappeared. "Okay, so it went behind the mesa," Dragon said, unimpressed. "Keep watching," Eric instructed. A few seconds later, a corresponding patch on the face of the mesa itself began to glow with a soft internal luminescence. The team leaned in closer to the monitor. "There it is," Travis breathed. The glow intensified for a second, then faded. And then from that exact spot, the point of light re-emerged, shooting out from the solid rock face and ascending back into the night sky. "Oh my gosh," Brandon whispered. "It flew out of the rock." They watched it again and again. There was no tunnel, no visible door. The object, whatever it was, had passed through solid matter as if it were water. It was a transmedium phenomenon, a vehicle or entity capable of operating in both the atmosphere and the dense medium of the Earth. This single piece of footage contextualized everything else. The strange materials inside the mesa were the shielding or structure of a hidden base. The tremors felt during the drilling were the vibrations of its systems, a defensive reaction to their intrusion. The UAPs weren't just visiting, they were coming and going from a local hub. Travis began to theorize about the physics required for such a feat. "We're talking about manipulating local space-time," he explained, sketching equations on a whiteboard. "To pass through solid matter, you'd need to create a bubble of warped space-time around you, effectively moving the space you're in through the space of the rock. Or you'd need to be able to dematerialize and rematerialize your atomic structure. It's quantum tunneling on a macroscopic scale. It's physics so far beyond ours, it might as well be magic." The cow mutilations and deaths, which had long been a dark and gruesome aspect of the ranch's lore, also took on a new light. The team analyzed surveillance footage of a cow that had died mysteriously near a fence line. In the animal's last moments, as it struggled to its feet, a dark, fast-moving object was captured, streaking through the sky directly above it. The object was blurry, but it had a distinct halo or bubble around it, reminiscent of the gimbal video released by the Pentagon. That bubble, Travis mused, staring at the image, could be an artifact of the camera, or it could be the visual representation of the warped space-time bubble, a gravitational lensing effect. If that thing passed close to the cow, the gravitational and radiation shear could have killed it instantly. The phenomena were not just strange, they were dangerous. The ranch wasn't just a laboratory, it was a wilderness filled with predators whose capabilities they were only beginning to comprehend. They were scientists studying lions, and they had just realized they were inside the cage. Part 4, The Quantum Looking Glass. Chapter 9, The Wormhole Hypothesis. The LiDAR data of the invisible hourglass-shaped structure above the triangle became the team's Rosetta Stone. It was the most bizarre and potentially the most significant piece of evidence they had ever collected. Eric Bard and Travis Taylor spent countless hours dissecting the 3D point cloud, trying to reconcile it with known physics. It looks for all the world like the diagrams you see in physics. Textbooks of a traversable wormhole, Travis said, rotating the model on the large screen in the command center. An Einstein-Rosen bridge. A tunnel through space-time. The concept was the stuff of science fiction, but it was grounded in Einstein's theory of general relativity. A wormhole, in theory, could connect two distant points in space and time. You could step through a doorway in Utah and emerge instantaneously in another galaxy or even another universe. But here's the problem. Travis continued pointing to the data void at the center of the structure. According to our current understanding, to keep a wormhole like this stable and open, you'd need vast amounts of what we call exotic matter, matter with negative mass and energy. The gravitational forces at the throat would be catastrophic. It would have ripped the helicopter out of the sky. It would have torn a chunk out of the planet. Yet it's there, Eric stated flatly. The data is repeatable. The lasers go in and they don't come back. Something is there and it's absorbing them. Whatever it is, it's operating under a set of physical laws that we don't understand. The GPS anomalies suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. GPS technology works by triangulating signals from a constellation of satellites. It relies on the fundamental assumption that space and time are constant. But if there was a localized warp in space-time, a wormhole hovering over the ranch, it would play havoc with those signals. The receivers on the ground weren't malfunctioning. They were accurately reporting their position in a section of space-time that was being actively bent and distorted. When a GPS unit reported its position as being 30 feet underground, it might have been telling the literal truth from its warped frame of reference. The implications were profound. The team wasn't just dealing with advanced technology or non-human intelligence. They were dealing with something that could manipulate the very fabric of reality. The ranch wasn't just a location, it was a destination. It was an interdimensional or interstellar travel hub, and the UAPs were its ships and passengers. The ancient legends, which had once seemed like poetic metaphors, now read like observational field notes. The indigenous people had spoken of portals to other worlds for centuries. Their ancestors hadn't been telling stories. They had been reporting the facts using the language of their time. The team, with all their advanced technology, had finally caught up. They had taken the first photograph of a ghost, and the ghost was a tear in the fabric of the cosmos. Chapter 10. The Hitchhiker. The phenomenon was not content to remain confined to the 512 acres of the ranch. It began to follow the team home. It started subtly. A set of keys not where you left them. A television turning on by itself. The kinds of things one could easily dismiss as coincidence or fatigue. But then the incidents escalated. Caleb Bench, the stoic former Marine, was the first to report something undeniable. He lived miles from the ranch in a quiet suburban neighborhood. One night his wife woke him, her face pale with fear. They could both hear it, the distinct, unmistakable sound of a heavy metallic object being dragged across their kitchen floor. Caleb grabbed his service weapon and swept the house. He found nothing. All the doors and windows were locked. But on the linoleum floor of the kitchen were deep, fresh gouges, as if someone had dragged an anchor through the room. Other team members experienced similar things. Disembodied voices in their homes, shadowy figures darting at the edge of their vision, electronics behaving erratically. Dragon, who had long been aware of this aspect of the phenomenon, called it the hitchhiker effect. Travis Everett, the physicist, struggled to find a rational explanation. It could be a psychological contagion, he suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. We're all under immense stress. We're primed to see strangeness everywhere. But as the reports mounted, he began to entertain a more radical and far more disturbing hypothesis rooted in quantum mechanics. The observer effect, he explained to Brandon one evening, his eyes alight with a feverish intensity. In the quantum world, the act of observing a particle changes its state. What if that principle applies on a macro scale here? What if the phenomenon on the ranch exists in a state of quantum superposition, a cloud of probabilities until it is observed by a conscious mind? He continued, warming to his theme. By observing it, by measuring it, we are collapsing its wave function, forcing it into a definite state in our reality. But what if that's not a one-way street? What if by observing it, we become entangled with it? quantum entanglement, what Einstein called spooky action at a distance, is the principle by which two particles can become linked in such a way that their fates are intertwined no matter how far apart they are. If you measure the spin of one, you instantly know the spin of the other. If we've become quantumly entangled with the core phenomenon at the ranch, Travis concluded the implications of his own words dawning on him, then a part of it is now linked to us. It can manifest in our homes miles away, because on a quantum level there is no distance. We stared into the abyss, and the abyss has latched onto us. The hitchhiker wasn't a ghost or a curse. It was a fundamental law of a new, terrifying physics. The team members were no longer just researchers. They were carriers unwillingly broadcasting the ranch's strangeness wherever they went. The personal cost of the investigation was no longer just about physical risk or professional reputation. The phenomenon was invading their lives, their homes, their sanctuaries. It was a stark reminder that they were not in control. They were trespassing in a place governed by rules they were only beginning to fathom, and they had tracked its otherworldly mud into their own world. Epilogue: The First Door. 6 months after the LiDAR confirmation of the wormhole-like structure, a sense of profound and sober purpose had settled over the team. The initial excitement had been tempered by the immense, almost crushing weight of their discoveries. They had set out to solve a mystery, but instead they had uncovered a reality more complex and alien than any of them had ever imagined. The command center, once a chaotic hub of new experiments, was now a quiet place of deep analysis. The fragmentary data streams they had captured, the brief energy spikes, the warped GPS signals, the anomalous materials from the mesa were being scrutinized, cross-referenced, and modeled. They understood now that they were not just collecting data points, they were learning the grammar of a new physics. One evening, Brandon Fugel stood on the porch of Homestead 2, looking out at the mesa as the setting sun painted it in shades of orange and purple. The land was no longer just a piece of real estate to him. It was a sacred trust, a gateway. He thought of his former life, his world of concrete certainties, and it seemed like a distant dream. The crisis of faith that had led him here had not been resolved in the way he'd expected. He hadn't found simple answers from a higher power. Instead, he had found a universe of infinite, staggering complexity, a reality filled with wonders and terrors that made his old questions seem small. Travis Taylor joined him, leaning against the porch railing. For a long time, neither of them spoke, both lost in their own thoughts. "You know," Travis said, finally breaking the silence, "we came here looking for the phenomenon singular, as if it were one thing, a nuts and bolts craft or a geophysical anomaly or a non-human intelligence." He gestured out at the darkening valley. "But it's not singular, it's plural. We're dealing with multiple phenomena, maybe a whole ecosystem. We've got the transmedium objects, the invisible energy structures, the hitchhiker effect, the biological consequences. It's all connected, but it's not all the same thing." Brandon nodded. "We haven't found the secret of Skinwalker Ranch, have we?" Travis let out a short, humorless laugh. "No, I don't think there is one secret. I think what we've found is the key to the first door. And behind that door isn't a single room with the answer written on the wall. It's an infinite corridor with more doors than we could ever count." The first stars were beginning to appear in the deep indigo sky. Above the mesa, a tiny, impossibly bright point of light flared into existence, hung there for a moment, and then vanished. It wasn't a satellite. It wasn't a plane. It was a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence they were only just beginning to read. The investigation was not over. It had just begun. Part 5, The Echo Chamber. Chapter 11, The Cosmic Symphony. The 1.6 gigahertz signal had been a constant companion since the beginning, a ghost in their machines, a heartbeat in the sky. To Eric Bard, it was a source of profound frustration. It defied triangulation, pulsed with maddening irregularity, and seemed to mock his every attempt to decipher its origin. But after the discovery of the wormhole structure, the team began to look at the signal in a new light. What if it wasn't just a beacon? What if it was a message? This new line of inquiry led them to Dr. Eris Thorne, a man whose reputation was a strange cocktail of genius and eccentricity. Thorne was a former SETI researcher and a brilliant cryptographer who had been drummed out of the mainstream scientific community for his radical theories on non-human intelligence. He argued that humanity was looking for alien communication in all the wrong ways, searching for a simple hello world in radio waves when a truly advanced intelligence would likely communicate in a medium that was as much a part of the wrong ways, universe's background noise, as the cosmic microwave background itself. Thorne, a gaunt man with a wild mane of gray hair and eyes that seemed to be permanently focused on a distant point, arrived at the ranch and immediately fell silent. He walked the property for hours, holding not a scientific instrument but a simple tuning fork, which he would occasionally strike and hold up to the sky. The universe is not a silent film, he finally announced to the baffled team. It is a symphony, and you gentlemen are sitting in the front row complaining about a single persistent note. In the command center, Thorne looked at Eric's data not as a series of spikes on a graph, but as a musical score. He ignored the amplitude and focused on the timing, the pauses, the flurries of activity, the intricate rhythms hidden within the signal's seemingly chaotic pulses. This isn't a beacon, Thorne declared, his finger tracing a complex pattern on the screen. It's a language, a profoundly complex, nonlinear language. See here, this is not random noise. This is a syntax based on prime numbers, and this modulation, it corresponds to the resonant frequency of hydrogen. They are not talking to us, they are talking through the very fabric of the cosmos. Under Thorne's guidance, Eric began a new analysis applying cryptographic and linguistic models to the terabytes of signal data. A breathtaking pattern emerged. The signal was a symphony of data, a multi-layered broadcast containing vast amounts of information from complex mathematical theorems to what looked eerily like star charts of unknown constellations. The question then became, could they talk back? We must not respond with the brutishness of a simple pulse, Thorne insisted. We must show them that we too can hold a note in the symphony. They devised an experiment. Using a powerful tunable radio transmitter, they wouldn't just blast a signal into the sky. They would echo the ranch's own signal back at it, but with a slight intentional modulation, a response based on one of the mathematical proofs they had deciphered. It was the equivalent of hearing a complex line of poetry and responding with a new line that not only rhymed, but also deepened the original's meaning. They aimed their transmitter at the data void above the triangle. The air crackled with anticipation as Eric initiated the broadcast. For a moment, nothing happened. The 1.6 gigahertz signal continued its enigmatic song seemingly unchanged. Then the ground groaned. A deep, resonant hum vibrated up through the soles of their feet. Every metallic surface on the ranch began to hum in sympathetic resonance. In the sky, the 1.6 gigahertz signal abruptly went silent. The sudden absence of the signal they had lived with for years was more shocking than any noise. Into that profound silence, a new signal was born. It was no longer confined to 1.6 gigahertz. It was a broad-spectrum cascade of frequencies, a wave of pure, structured information that washed over their sensors, overloading them in a torrent of data. On Eric's screen, the waterfall display bloomed into a dazzling, impossibly complex shape, a geometric mandala of pure energy. They had answered a single note, and the entire orchestra had responded. Chapter 12. The Mesa's Heartbeat. The overwhelming response from the sky forced the team to turn their attention back to the ground, specifically to the mesa. If the anomaly above was the speaker, was the mesa the amplifier? Armed with the knowledge of the exotic materials buried within its stone heart, they abandoned the idea of brute force drilling in favor of a more subtle approach. Travis, inspired by techniques used in non-destructive material analysis, proposed using seismic resonance. The plan was to use a network of thumper trucks vehicles that could deliver precise low-frequency vibrations into the ground to gently ping the mesa. By analyzing the returning seismic echoes, they could create a detailed three-dimensional map of its internal structure without ever breaking rock. Think of it like tapping on a wall to find the studs, Travis explained. Except our wall is a mountain, and we're looking for something that has no business being there. They positioned the thumper trucks around the base of the mesa. The process was slow and methodical. A low rhythmic thumping, almost like a giant slow-motion heartbeat, began to echo through the basin. In the command center, a complex 3D model of the mesa's interior began to take shape on the monitors built from the returning sound waves. At first, the model showed what they expected, layers of sedimentary rock fissures and solid stone. But as they focused the vibrations on the area where the drill had stopped, a new structure began to emerge from the data. It was not a solid object. It was a vast hollow space, roughly spherical and hundreds of feet in diameter. And inside that space, suspended in the very center, was a dense metallic object shaped like a massive, multifaceted crystal. It was a stunning confirmation of their suspicions. The mesa was indeed a hangar, and it held a craft or device of unimaginable size. But as they continued to pulse the mesa with the low-frequency vibrations, something even more extraordinary occurred. The object inside the mesa began to respond. It started as a faint energy spike detected by the sensitive magnetometers placed on the rock face. As the thumping continued, the spikes grew stronger, falling into a perfect rhythmic cadence. The object inside the mesa was emitting a slow, steady energy pulse. It had a heartbeat. "It's waking up," Dragon said, his voice, a low rumble of awe and fear. The team fell silent, watching the rhythmic pulse on the screen. They were not just mapping an inert object, they were communicating with a dormant entity. The seismic vibrations were not just echoes, they were a form of sonar, and something inside the mesa was sonaring back. The connection between the sky and the ground was no longer a theory. They were witnessing it in real time, a dialogue between the Sky Symphony and the beating heart within the earth. Part 6, The Presence Chapter, 13, The Quickening. Waking the heart in the mountain changed everything. The seismic experiment did not simply end, it initiated a new phase. The low rhythmic pulse they had detected did not fade when the thumper trucks fell silent. It continued a soft subsonic thrum that was felt more than heard, a constant reminder of the titanic crystalline entity sleeping in the rock. The ranch was no longer just watchful, it was awake. This awakening manifested as a dramatic and unnerving escalation of phenomena. The team began calling it the quickening. The sky, once a stage for fleeting orbs and distant silent craft, became a chaotic theater. On clear nights, without provocation, the space above the triangle would come alive. Faint geometric patterns of light, like ghostly circuit boards, would flash across the stars. Orbs of light would appear not singly, but in swarms, moving in complex synchronized formations that defied any explanation of drone technology. They would dance, converge, and then vanish in an instant. The land itself seemed to grow more volatile. At Homestead 2, the team recorded EVP electronic voice phenomena that were no longer just whispers. They were clear, multisyllabic words in a language that was utterly alien, a cacophony of clicks, chimes, and guttural tones. The ground around the homestead would often be covered in a strange, shimmering frost on mornings when the temperature had never dropped below freezing. The wildlife once scarce became bizarrely present. Owls would stare unblinking into the surveillance cameras from mere inches away. Coyotes would gather in silent circles on the ridge, not howling, but simply watching the homesteads with an unnerving stillness. The hitchhiker effect intensified to an almost unbearable degree. Team members' families reported seeing tall, shadowy figures standing in their hallways at night, figures that would dissolve when a light was turned on. Eric Bard came to the command center one morning, his face ashen, after his young daughter had woken up screaming, describing a man made of TV static standing by her bed. The quantum entanglement Travis had theorized about was no longer a subtle background effect, it was a direct psychological assault. The pulse from the mesa was the metronome to this rising crescendo of strangeness. It was the ranch's new heartbeat, and with every beat, its reality seemed to bleed more freely and aggressively into their own. They had knocked on the door of the abyss, and now the abyss was kicking the door down from the other side. Chapter 14, The Consciousness Probe. We are treating this like an engineering problem. Dr. Thorne said one night, his wild eyes scanning the faces of the exhausted team in the command center. We ping, it responds. We transmit it, broadcasts. We are interacting with a machine. But what if we are wrong? What if the crystal in the mesa is not a machine, but a mind, a consciousness so vast and ancient that our concept of individuality is meaningless to it? The idea was a radical leap, pushing them from the edge of physics into the heart of metaphysics. But the phenomena were no longer behaving like a predictable system. They were responsive, almost emotional. The displays of light felt like expressions. The hitchhiker events felt like intrusions. Travis Ever, the experimentalist, latched on to Thorne's idea. If it's a consciousness, then our sensors are the wrong tools. A spectrum analyzer can't measure an idea. A magnetometer can't detect an emotion. We need a new kind of sensor. The human mind, Thorne whispered, completing the thought. The most sensitive quantum device we know of. The plan they devised was the most dangerous and controversial yet. They would attempt to establish direct conscious contact. They couldn't risk sending someone physically into the triangle or the mesa, but they could create a focused, shielded environment, a modern-day sensory deprivation chamber, and use a human subject as a biological antenna aimed directly at the heart of the phenomenon. After much debate, the subject chosen was not a psychic or a medium, but a member of their own team, Eric Bard. His experience with his daughter, combined with his own quiet admissions of experiencing disorienting flashes of insight and moments of profound dread, made him the most entangled among them. He was terrified, but his scientific curiosity and his desperate need for answers for his family overrode his fear. They constructed a small electromagnetically shielded chamber near Homestead 2. Inside, Eric would sit in a comfortable chair wired with EEG and biometric sensors to monitor his vital signs and brain activity in real time. The chamber would filter out all external sensory input, leaving his consciousness as a blank slate. Using a device of Travis's own invention, a helmet lined with precisely tuned magnetic coils, they would attempt to modulate his brainwaves to resonate with the low-frequency pulse emanating from the mesa. "We're not sending a signal, Eric Travis," explained, his voice gentle as he fitted the helmet over his friend's head. "We're tuning the receiver. Just relax, clear your mind, and listen." The heavy door of the chamber was sealed. The magnetic coils were activated. In the command center, the team watched Eric's brainwave patterns on the monitor. At first, they were normal alpha and beta waves. Then, as the magnetic field synchronized with the mesa's pulse, his brain activity exploded. The EEG flatlined, overwhelmed by a signal of impossible amplitude and complexity. Inside the silent darkness of the chamber, Eric Bard was no longer listening. He was drowning in an ocean of pure consciousness. Part 7. Contact. For Eric Bard, there was no transition. One moment he was sitting in the silent manufactured dark, focusing on his breathing. The next, his existence dissolved. The concepts of self, of body, of time, of here and there became meaningless artifacts of a forgotten reality. He was a single drop of awareness falling into an infinite, timeless ocean. There were no images, no sounds, no alien voices. It was a torrent of pure, raw knowing. He did not see the history of the Uinta Basin. He experienced 1 billion years of geology, the slow crush of rock and the patient carving of water as a single sustained thought. He did not see the wormhole above the triangle. He became the twisted geometry of space-time, feeling the agonizing tension of a reality bent past its breaking point. He perceived time not as a river, but as a vast frozen landscape. He could feel the past and the future as physical places, accessible and real. He witnessed the arrival of the crystalline consciousness, not as a spaceship landing, but as a note of music, inserting itself into a silent symphony, an event that had happened in a forgotten epoch, but was also somehow happening right now. He understood its nature. It was not a being in the way a human is a being. It was a system, a regulator, a vast geological scale mind whose purpose was to perceive and maintain the integrity of reality in its locality. It was less a pilot and more the immune system of the dimension itself. In the command center, the team watched in horror and awe. Eric's biometric data was a chaotic storm. His heart rate fluctuated wildly from near arrest to a frantic, unsustainable pace. His body temperature spiked and plummeted. But the EEG was the true impossibility. The signal was no longer biological. The readouts displayed a perfectly coherent, structured waveform of immense complexity. It was a fractal, a mathematical object of infinite detail blooming across the screen. My God, Dr. Thorne breathed, his face pale. It's not just resonating with him, it's using him. His brain, it's become a peripheral, a biological modem. Shut it down! Dragon roared, moving toward the chamber. Shut it down now! No, wait, Travis yelled, holding him back, his eyes glued to the impossible data scrolling past. Look at the structure. This isn't just noise, it's information. This is the language Thorne was talking about. We're recording the source code of the universe. The ethical horror of what they were doing warred with the scientific imperative. For 3 minutes that stretched into an eternity, they let it continue recording a torrent of data that would take them decades, if not centuries, to fully comprehend. Finally, as Eric's body began to convulse violently, Brandon Fugel made the call. That's enough. Get him out. They cut the power to the magnetic coils. On the EEG, the impossible fractal pattern vanished, replaced by the flat line of a brain experiencing massive trauma. They wrenched the chamber door open and were met with a metallic coppery smell of ozone and blood. Eric was slumped in the chair unconscious, a trickle of blood running from his nose. His eyes were open but utterly blank, staring at a reality none of them could see. Chapter 16, The Broken Messenger. Eric Bard did not wake up for 2 days. When he did, he was a changed man. The quiet, methodical data analyst was gone, replaced by a haunted, fragile stranger who seemed to exist in a state of perpetual distraction, his eyes often losing focus as if he were listening to a conversation no one else could hear. He couldn't articulate his experience in any linear fashion. Language, a tool designed to describe a three-dimensional world with linear time, was wholly inadequate. He would speak in fragments and riddles and paradoxes. He would sit for hours compulsively drawing on any available surface napkins, whiteboards, the dusty floor of the command center. He drew the same things over and over, the complex fractal mandalas they had seen on the EEG, intricate star charts of alien skies, and horrifyingly sketches of creatures that seemed to be born from a fever dream, beings of mismatched limbs, impossible angles, and shimmering, indistinct forms. Slowly, painfully, with Dr. Thorne acting as a gentle interpreter, a core message began to emerge from the fragments. "It's not a door," Eric would whisper, his hand shaking, as he drew the hourglass shape of the wormhole. "It's a wound, a tear." The entity in the mesa, he explained, was not native to this reality. It was a caretaker, a reality anchor that had been in place for a measure of time so vast it was nearly meaningless. Its function was to regulate a natural but dangerously unstable weak point in the fabric of space-time. The portal was not a technology, it was a cosmic phenomenon, and the crystal was the bandage holding it in check. But its old Eric would say, a profound sadness in his voice. "It's tired. The bandage is fraying." The quickening the escalation of phenomena was not a result of their provocations being met with aggression. It was the system failing. Their experiments, the rockets, the radio signals, the seismic vibrations were like a child banging a stick against a cracking dam. The bizarre creatures he drew were not aliens in the traditional sense. They were opportunistic realities, other dimensions, other physical laws bleeding through the cracks. The man made of TV static his daughter had seen was not a ghost. It was a visitor from a reality where matter was composed of pure information. The message was not a greeting or a threat, it was a cry for help. The mesa's consciousness had reached out to them using Eric as a conduit because it was losing its ability to hold the line. The phenomena were not the secret of Skinwalker Ranch. They were the symptoms of its impending collapse. On Chapter 17, Ampere's New and Terrible Science. The revelation sent a shockwave through the team, fracturing their scientific consensus and forcing them to confront the terrifying implications of their work. They were no longer explorers mapping a new continent. They were doctors who had just diagnosed a terminal illness in their own planet's reality. Travis Taylor, the hard-nosed physicist, was shaken to his core. Eric's subjective traumatic experience was scientifically useless on its own. But the data, the fractal brainwaves, the correlation with the mesa's pulse, was undeniable. He retreated into his work, trying to build a new theoretical framework, a physics of consciousness that could accommodate what they had witnessed. If Eric is right, Travis argued during one tense briefing, then we should be able to detect these leaking realities. They would have different physical laws. We could design experiments to look for transient, localized fluctuations in fundamental constants, the speed of light, the charge of an electron. If we can get a positive reading even for a microsecond, then the unthinkable becomes a testable hypothesis. Dr. Thorne, however, saw the situation in much starker terms. You are still thinking like a mechanic, Doctor. You wish to diagnose the engine while the entire ship is plunging into a black hole. We have made contact with a non-human post-physical intelligence. The next step is not to measure, it is to understand. The message was a plea. We must learn how to respond to that plea. Dragon and Brandon Fugel were concerned with a more immediate problem: safety. The hitchhiker effect was no longer a paranormal curiosity. It was a direct consequence of a fraying reality. These things Eric is drawing, Dragon said, his voice grim as he tapped one of the monstrous sketches. If they are starting to bleed through here, how long before they bleed through into our homes, our cities? We woke this thing up. The quickening started with us. Maybe the best thing we can do is pack up, leave, and hope it goes back to sleep. We can't, Brandon said, his face etched with the weight of his responsibility. He looked at Eric, who was sitting in a corner sketching a complex diagram of what looked like a multidimensional atom. We were invited in. We have been shown the problem. Walking away now is not an option. It's an abdication. The team was at an impasse, torn between the scientific imperative to understand the human instinct to survive and a new terrifying moral duty. They were in possession of the most important secret in human history. The reality they took for granted was fragile, and it was breaking. Chapter 18, The Invitation. The decision came from the most unlikely source. A week after the experiment, Eric Bard walked into the command center. For the first time since his ordeal, his eyes were clear, his hands steady. He looked at the team, his gaze holding a new and profound authority. "It's not dead," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And it's not dying, it's recalibrating. It used me to interface with our reality to understand our mathematics, our biology, our consciousness. It needed a translation key. Now it has one." He walked to the large monitor displaying the 3D seismic map of the crystal inside the mesa. It's not a bandage, it's a key. A key that tunes reality, that reinforces the laws of our dimension and keeps the others out. But it's been damaged millennia ago, an impact. He was referring to a theory Travis had been developing about the Uinta Basin itself being a massive ancient impact crater. "The key is broken," Eric continued, "and it no longer resonates at the correct frequency to maintain the lock. The symphony we're hearing is the sound of the tumblers grinding. It's the sound of the lock failing." He turned to face them, his expression one of immense gravity. "It showed me the damage. It showed me the frequency it needs to be restored. It can't generate the frequency itself. It doesn't have the tools. It can only maintain. It can't repair." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent room. It wasn't a cry for help. It was an invitation. It was a schematic. A new kind of silence descended on the team, a silence filled with a terrifying and exhilarating understanding. They had been trying to understand the phenomenon, to measure it, to survive it. But the phenomenon had been trying to understand them. It had been vetting them, testing them, and had finally found them capable. They were no longer just observers. They were being asked to be participants. The choice was no longer about whether to stay or to go. The choice was whether to answer the invitation, to take the schematic, the key to reality, and attempt to build a device based on a physics they barely understood to repair a wound in space-time. It was an insane, impossible task, with the fate of their world hanging in the balance. Standing in the heart of the enigma, they understood that the secret of Skinwalker Ranch wasn't what was there, it was what they were meant to do about it. Part 8, The Resonator Project, Chapter 19, The Language of Creation. The schematic was not a blueprint. It was a madness of insight, a storm of data that existed in the fragile nexus of Eric Bard's mind, the fractal waveforms from his EEG and his frantic, obsessive sketches. For Travis Taylor, it was the most frustrating and exhilarating challenge of his life. He was an engineer who built things with tolerances and material specifications, and his source material was a man who spoke in koans and drew pictures of impossible geometry. The command center transformed. Whiteboards were covered in a chaotic collage of Eric's drawings, Travis's differential equations, and Thorne's cryptographic notations. The three men formed an unlikely trinity attempting to translate a post-human language into the clumsy syntax of human science. It's about harmonics, Travis would say, pointing to a complex wave pattern, but not just sound. It's a harmonic of space-time itself, a chord. The chord is dissonant. Thorne would counter tracing one of Eric's mandalas. This geometry is the notation. It shows us the shape of the correct chord. The frequency is not a number. It's a multi-dimensional shape. Eric was their oracle. He couldn't explain the concepts logically, but he could feel when they were getting closer. Travis would propose a mathematical model, and Eric would shake his head. No, the curve is wrong. It feels cold. Thorne would suggest a linguistic interpretation of a data burst, and Eric would nod slowly. Yes, that's the color of it. They slowly pieced it together. They were not building an engine or a weapon. They were building a musical instrument, a tuning fork. They named it the resonator. Its purpose was to generate a complex, multi-layered wave of energy, part electromagnetic, part gravitational, part something else for which they had no name, that would resonate with the damaged crystal in the mesa. The goal was to coax the crystal, the key, back to its correct vibrational state, allowing it to reinforce the lock on their reality. The design that emerged was as much a work of art as a piece of technology. It was based on a central core, a synthetic crystal they would have to grow themselves surrounded by a lattice of superconducting coils and precisely angled waveguides. And most terrifyingly, the schematic was incomplete. There was a missing component, a central regulator that the data only hinted at. It's the operator, Eric said one night, his eyes distant. The device is inert without a conscious mind to complete the circuit. It needs a pilot. All eyes in the room turned to him. The resonator would not just be a machine they turned on, it would be a machine someone had to become. Chapter 20, The Forge of the Impossible. The decision to build the resonator was the crossing of a final Rubicon. Brandon Fugel, a man accustomed to calculating risk on balance sheets, was now underwriting a project whose failure could mean the unraveling of reality itself. He convened a final meeting in the main homestead, the air thick with the gravity of their choice. "What you are proposing," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the immense strain, "is to build a device based on alien principles to repair something we barely understand with potentially catastrophic consequences if we fail." The financial cost is irrelevant at this point. The moral cost, the risk to all of you, to your families, to everything beyond this fence line, that is the question. Dragon, who had been silent for most of the technical discussion, spoke up. "For years I've been trying to keep a lid on this place, trying to stop it from hurting my men, my friends. But the lid is coming off anyway. The quickening is real. The hitchhiker isn't just knocking on the door anymore, it's coming inside. Doing nothing is no longer the safe option. Doing nothing is just waiting for the dam to break." His words settled it. They were unanimous. The risk of action, however, great was now less than the risk of inaction. With Brandon's full financial backing, the ranch was transformed. One of the large outbuildings became a cleanroom laboratory and fabrication workshop, a pocket of sterile, high-tech order in the midst of paranormal chaos. The project was codenamed The Forge. Travis led the Herculean effort. The central crystal for the resonator couldn't be mined. It had to be grown. They constructed a zero-gravity suspension chamber where a seed crystal was bombarded with specific frequencies and magnetic fields, slowly accumulating atoms into the precise, multifaceted shape from Eric's drawings. It was a process that took weeks of constant, meticulous control, where a single power fluctuation or stray vibration could shatter the delicate lattice. The superconducting coils were another impossibility. No known alloy could handle the theoretical energy loads. Travis, working from the metallurgical reports from the mesa and the cryptic data from Eric's download, developed a new type of sintered metamaterial combining selenium and vanadium with a conductive polymer under immense pressure, heat. The process was volatile, with several early attempts ending in small, violent explosions that tested the limits of the lab's containment shields. As the components of the resonator slowly came into being, the ranch seemed to take notice. The construction was plagued by high strangeness events. Tools would vanish from a workbench, only to reappear twisted into impossible shapes on the other side of the room. The complex software controlling the crystal growth would be corrupted with lines of code that, according to Thorne, resembled ancient Sumerian. It was a constant battle against an environment that was actively hostile to their progress. Chapter 21, Antibodies of Reality. The closer they came to completing the resonator, the more the fabric of the ranch's reality seemed to fray. The opportunistic realities Eric had warned of were no longer just flickers at the edge of perception. They were becoming manifest. The first physical encounter happened near the Triangle. Two members of Dragon's security team on a routine patrol saw a shimmering distortion in the air similar to the blob the high-speed cameras had captured. But this time, it coalesced. For a terrifying 10 seconds, it took on a definite physical form. It was one of the creatures from Eric's darkest sketches, a being of disjointed limbs covered in a chitinous hide that seemed to shift in color and texture. It moved with a twitching, unnatural gait, and as it passed over the dry grass, the ground beneath its feet instantly withered and died, turning a greasy, blackish gray. It paid the two men no mind, simply walking a few paces before dissolving back into a shimmer, and then nothing. The security team was now armed not just with conventional weapons, but with high-intensity UV emitters and sonic projectors. Travis had jury-rigged, hoping that hostile frequencies of light and sound might disrupt such unstable entities. The ranch was no longer a research site, it was a contested zone. Dragon's men were no longer guards. They were the first line of defense in an interdimensional Cold War. The hitchhiker effect also evolved from a psychological nuisance to a physical threat. Travis's wife called him from their home in a panic. The stainless steel toaster in their kitchen had spontaneously melted into a puddle of slag, leaving a scorch mark on the granite countertop even though it had been unplugged. Brandon Fugel, alone in his high-rise office in Salt Lake City, watched in stunned silence as the solid glass of his floor-to-ceiling window momentarily turned liquid, rippling like water for several seconds before re-solidifying. The team was living in a state of siege, both on the ranch and in their own homes. The pressure was immense. They were in a race forging their weapon, while the walls of their reality grew thinner with each passing day. The entities bleeding through were like antibodies, an immune response from a foreign reality trying to destroy the infection that was their attempt to heal the wound. Chapter 22, The Ghost in the Resonator. After 3 months of relentless, harrowing work, it was finished. The resonator stood in the center of the lab, a masterpiece of impossible engineering. It was a 7-foot-tall structure of interlocking rings of the dark selenium alloy, all focused on the central, faintly glowing crystal, which pulsed with a soft internal light. It was beautiful alien and radiated an almost palpable sense of latent power. The activation sequence was the most critical experiment they had ever conceived. They couldn't simply turn it on. The device had no power switch. It drew ambient energy from its environment, but it required a conscious, quantum-entangled mind to focus and shape that energy. It required Eric. He entered the shielded control room, his face calm but resolute. He would not wear a helmet this time. The device was tuned directly to his unique biological and quantum signature. He would interface with it through pure focus, guided by Thorne and monitored by Travis. "Begin the sequence," Brandon ordered from the observation deck. Eric closed his eyes. In the lab, the resonator remained dark. On his monitors, Travis watched Eric's brainwaves begin to shift, no longer chaotic, as in the probe, but forming a coherent, controlled pattern. He was matching the frequency, not just receiving it. A low hum filled the lab, and the crystal in the resonator's core began to glow brighter, its internal light shifting from a soft white to a brilliant electric blue. The interlocking rings around it began to slowly counter-rotate, floating on a magnetic field with no visible means of support. But it was what happened next that stopped everyone's breath. As Eric deepened his connection, a new light appeared within the crystal. It was a swirling, nebulous form, like a galaxy being born. It moved and shifted in direct response to Eric's brain activity. When a wave of anxiety went through the control room, the light flickered and turned a blood red. When Thorne projected a feeling of calm, focused inquiry, it stabilized back to a steady blue. "It's alive," Travis whispered. "Or it's a mirror. It's reflecting the consciousness of its operator." The resonator was more than a machine. It was a quantum amplifier for consciousness. The ghost in their machine was them. For their first test, they had identified a persistent, localized gravitational anomaly near Homestead. 2, a spot where dropped objects would fall slightly slower than they should. It was a tiny, stable tear in the fabric. "Okay," Eric Travis said over the intercom, "focus on that anomaly. Use the resonator. Don't push, just harmonize. Show it what the correct gravitational constant should feel like." Eric took a deep breath. In the lab, a thin, brilliant beam of blue light, almost too fine to see, shot from the top of the resonator through the roof of the lab and lanced across the property towards Homestead 2. It made no sound. On a separate monitor, a live feed from a gravimeter at the target site showed the anomalous reading. As the beam hit, the erratic line on the graph wavered for a moment and then snapped perfectly into line with the baseline measurement for normal gravity. It held there steady and true. A wave of triumphant, breathless relief washed through the control room. It had worked. They had built a tool that could actively repair a flaw in the physical laws of the universe. But as they watched, the gravimeter reading began to twitch again. The moment Eric broke his concentration, the anomaly began to reassert itself. The resonator wasn't a permanent fix. It was a constant, active process. It was a shield that had to be held, a song that had to be sung without end. They had not built a solution. They had built a lifetime commitment, and the fate of their reality now rested on the focus and endurance of one fragile human mind. Part 9. The Final Chord, Chapter 23. The Keeper of the Song. Eric Bard's life ceased to be his own. He became the keeper of the song, the living component of a machine that held the world together. The resonator's control room, a small shielded bunker adjacent to the forge, became his entire world. He lived there, slept there on a small cot, and ate the meals that were brought to him in silence. He was no longer just Eric, the husband, father, and scientist. He was the operator. The strain was unimaginable. To maintain the shield, he had to exist in a state of perpetual focused meditation, his consciousness intertwined with the resonator's crystalline core. He didn't just control the device, he was the device. His thoughts were the energy beams that lanced out to patch the fraying edges of their dimension. He could feel the small tears in space-time as a musician feels a discordant note, a sourness, a pressure, a subtle wrongness that he had to constantly, actively correct. He aged a decade in a matter of months. His hair became shot through with gray, and deep lines were etched around his eyes. But his eyes themselves held a strange new depth, a cosmic weariness mixed with a profound, almost serene understanding. He was a man looking at two realities at once: the solid walls of his control room and the swirling, chaotic ocean of possibilities that lay just beyond the veil. His connection to the outside world became tenuous. His family visited standing on the other side of a thick pane of shielded glass, their voices sounding distant and strange to him. He could see the love and fear in their eyes, but he struggled to connect with it. Their worries about mortgages and school plays felt like echoes from a forgotten life. His worries were about gravitational constants and the integrity of the Planck length. Travis and Thorne became his anchors. They learned to interpret the subtle shifts in the resonator's energy output as Eric's own mental and emotional state. A spike in gamma radiation meant he was stressed. A dip in the neutrino count meant his focus was wavering. They became the technicians for a machine whose primary component was a human soul. "He's learning," Thorne observed one night, watching the steady rhythmic pulse of the resonator's core. "He is no longer just holding the shield, he is strengthening it. He is learning to weave his own consciousness into the fabric to reinforce it from within. He is not just singing the song of reality, he is adding his own verse." Eric was becoming something more than human, a lonely sentinel standing watch at the edge of existence. He was the keeper of a terrible, beautiful song, and the price of his vigil was everything he had once been. Chapter 24. The Cacophony. While Eric's tireless efforts kept the smaller incursions at bay, it was, as Travis grimly put it, like using sandbags against a tsunami. The resonator could patch the little leaks, but the fundamental pressure from the great wound, the wormhole above the triangle, was building. The quickening did not stop. It changed. The chaotic random manifestations were replaced by a more focused and infinitely more malevolent pressure. The antibodies of reality that breached the perimeter were no longer just wandering, confused monstrosities. They began to act with purpose. A security patrol near the mesa was ambushed. The creatures, the chitinous beings of wrong angles, did not simply appear and disappear. They emerged from the solid rock of the mesa itself, their forms unstable, but their intent clear. They moved with a terrifying coordinated intelligence, forcing Dragon's team into a firefight where conventional bullets seemed to pass through the creatures one moment and slam into an impossibly hard shell the next. The team only survived because of Travis's sonic projectors, which seemed to cause the creatures intense distress, disrupting their physical cohesion and forcing them to retreat back into the rock. The pressure was also directed at the resonator itself. The air around the forge began to warp. A compass held 100 yards away would spin uselessly. The very ground seemed to vibrate with a discordant, sickening hum that fought against the pure harmonic tone of the resonator. It was a battle of frequencies, a cosmic arm wrestling match between their reality and the one trying to break through. The greatest strain was on Eric. In his meditative state, he could feel the pressure as a physical force, a wall of screaming, chaotic noise pushing against the fragile harmony he was maintaining. Sometimes he would cry out in his sleep, his hands clenched, his biometrics going haywire as a particularly strong wave of dissonance washed over him. "We're losing," Travis admitted to Brandon one night, gesturing to a map of the ranch covered in red markers indicating major incursions. Eric can't hold this forever. Every time he patches a leak, the pressure builds on the main wound. Sooner or later, it's going to burst wide open. We have to address the source. We have to retune the key in the mesa. The resonator, their miracle weapon, had revealed itself to be a temporary shield. The time had come for the final desperate gamble. They had to move from defense to offense. They had to heal the source of the wound itself. Chapter 25, The Final Gambit. The plan was born from Travis's physics, Thorne's metaphysics, and Eric's fractured cosmic insight. It was terrifyingly simple in concept and insurmountably complex in execution. They could not move the mountains, so they would have to move their machine. They would transport the resonator to the base of the mesa. From there, Eric would perform the most dangerous operation imaginable. He would have to phase the resonator's energy beam through the solid rock, using the same transmedium principles the UAPs employed to directly interface with the crystalline key. "It's not enough to just play the right note," Thorne explained, his voice low and intense. "He must become the conductor of a two-piece orchestra. He has to listen to the dissonant song of the damaged key while simultaneously playing the perfect healing chord of the resonator. He must find the harmony between the two and unify them. He'll be at the focal point of two immense conflicting energies," Travis added, his face grim. "The feedback loop could destroy the resonator, the mesa crystal, and him." The logistics were a nightmare. Moving the delicate humming resonator from the forge to the mesa was a monumental task. Every vibration, every shift in its electromagnetic environment threatened to destabilize it. Dragon's team constructed a specialized magnetically levitated transport sled, and the path to the mesa was meticulously cleared. The entire operation had to be timed to the millisecond, a window of relative calm in the ranch's chaotic energy cycle that Eric, through his connection, had identified. As they prepared, the ranch fought back with a focused fury. It was no longer a siege. It was an all-out war. The sky above the mesa swirled with a sickly purple-green light, a constant storm of energy that made the air smell of ozone. The chitinous creatures no longer made sporadic raids. They began to emerge in waves, forcing Dragon's team into a constant running battle to maintain a secure perimeter around the mesa. The night of the operation arrived. A full, unnaturally bright moon hung in the sky, casting the ranch in an eerie silver light. The resonator, glowing with a steady blue luminescence, was loaded onto the transport sled. Perimeter is as secure as it's going to get. Dragon's voice crackled over the radio. But they're massing on the ridge. It's like they know. Eric, are you ready? Brandon asked, his voice echoing in the tense silence of the control bunker, now a mobile command center. From his chair, Eric nodded, his eyes closed. The song is getting louder, he whispered. It's time to face the music. With a low hum, the transport sled began its slow, perilous journey across the dark, hostile landscape, carrying the only hope for a world that had no idea it was on the brink of annihilation. Chapter 26, The Conductor and the Storm. The journey to the mesa was a crawl through a nightmare. The path was lit by the arcing high-energy discharges from the sky and the muzzle flashes from the security team's desperate defense. The creatures that swarmed from the shadows were faster and more cunning than before, their forms less indistinct, as if the encroaching reality was becoming more stable, more real within our own. Inside the mobile command center, Travis and Thorne were a blur of activity monitoring the resonator's stability. Every energy blast, every sonic shockwave threatened to throw the delicate machine out of tune. "He's holding it," Travis muttered, his eyes locked on a screen showing the resonator's core. The light is steady. Eric is acting as a perfect quantum buffer. They reached the base of the mesa. The rock face in front of them seemed to thrum with a palpable discordant energy. The air was so thick with it that it was hard to breathe. "We're in position," Dragon reported, his voice strained. "But we can't hold them back for long." Now Eric Thorne said, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. "Forget the shield, forget the perimeter. Focus on the heart. Find the key." In his mind, Eric pushed past the screaming chaos of the battle. He reached out with his consciousness amplified by the resonator, and for the first time he touched the mind of the mesa crystal directly. It was not the gentle, sad intelligence he had felt before. It was a being in agony, a consciousness fractured and screaming, deafened by its own dissonant, broken song. "I have it," Eric gasped, his body trembling. "Now, Eric, the chord," Travis yelled. "Play the chord." Eric took a breath, and through the resonator he sang. He projected the perfect multidimensional frequency. They had reverse-engineered a wave of pure harmonic order directly into the heart of the mesa. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic. A wave of pure white light erupted from the resonator, not as a beam, but as a perfect expanding sphere. It struck the mesa, and for a heart-stopping moment, the ancient rock became translucent, revealing the massive, glowing, and now violently shaking crystal suspended within. The two frequencies met, the pure harmonic chord of the resonator and the screaming broken chord of the key. The world dissolved into a war of music. The cacophony was so immense that it became a physical force throwing the security team from their feet. The creatures of the other reality shrieked and dissolved into black smoke as the wave of pure reality washed over them. In the bunker, the electronics exploded in a shower of sparks. Travis was thrown against a wall. Only Eric remained in his chair, a conduit for a power that could unmake worlds, his face a mask of supreme effort, blood streaming from his nose and ears. He was holding the two impossible notes, trying to force them into harmony. The light from the mesa and the light from the resonator pulsed faster and faster, a strobe of creation and destruction. Then with a final soul-shattering crescendo that was not a sound but a universal feeling of release, the two lights merged. They collapsed into a single perfect point of infinitesimally bright, silent blue-white light. And then there was only silence. Epilogue, the new silence. The silence was the first thing they noticed. It wasn't the dead, watchful silence that had first greeted them years ago. This was a new silence, a clean silence, filled with the simple, natural sounds of the wind in the sagebrush and the distant cry of a hawk. The oppressive, anxiety-inducing hum of the ranch was gone. The sky was a simple, clear blue. The swirling energy storm had vanished. The ground felt solid, stable, and utterly normal. They found Eric Bard slumped in his chair, unconscious but alive. The resonator was inert, its crystal dark and cool to the touch. It had given everything it had. The days that followed were surreal. The high strangeness events ceased. The 1.6 gigahertz signal was gone. The GPS units reported their positions with boring, unwavering accuracy. The hitchhiker effect faded from the lives of the team members, leaving behind only the scars of memory. The creatures did not return. The wound, it seemed, was closed. Eric recovered, but the man who returned was neither the haunted messenger nor the stoic scientist he had once been. He was quiet, serene. The cosmic knowledge remained, but it no longer tormented him. It had settled into a deep, peaceful wisdom. He had faced the storm and become the silence that followed. 6 months after the event they called the Convergence, Brandon Fugel and Travis Taylor stood once more on the path overlooking the ranch. The land was beautiful, peaceful, and almost disappointingly ordinary. "So we did it," Brandon said the words, "feeling inadequate. We won." "I don't think won is the right word," Travis replied, his gaze on the mesa. "We survived. We helped the system heal itself. The intelligence in the mesa, it's still there. The key is repaired. It's just quiet now. It's doing its job." "And the portal, the wormhole?" Brandon asked. "The tear is sealed," Travis said, "but the potential is still there. This place will always be a sensitive point in space-time, but the lock is fixed." He paused, "for now." They had not defeated an enemy. They had assisted a cosmic caretaker, a silent guardian of their reality. They had been given a glimpse behind the curtain of existence and had been asked to help mend it. The secret of Skinwalker Ranch was not that aliens existed. It was not that monsters were real. The secret was that reality itself was a fragile, beautiful, and complex song, and that sometimes it required a conductor. Brandon looked out at the tranquil valley, a place that had almost broken them all, a place that had shown them the face of God in the geometry of a fractal and the heart of the universe in a screaming, wounded crystal. His faith crisis was over. He had found his answer not in Scripture, but in the terrifying, magnificent symphony of the cosmos. Humanity was not alone in the universe, and it was not the sole proprietor of its own reality. They were part of a much grander, much stranger, and much older story, and for the first time in their history, they had written their own verse.